We've all had that moment in a game where the challenge feels completely off balance. Either a boss wipes you out in seconds despite hours of preparation, or the enemies fall so easily that the thrill disappears. This swing between punishing frustration and hollow ease is what players call unbalanced difficulty. It's not just about being too hard or too easy, it's about the pacing of the challenge failing to match the player's growth. When difficulty isn't tuned properly, it can break immersion, discourage progress, or even make victories feel meaningless. But firstly, what does unbalanced difficulty even mean? Unbalanced difficulty happens when pacing of challenges in a game doesn't align with players' growth or expectations. Instead of gradually building tension and reward, the game either spikes too early, forcing players into sudden walls of frustration, or dips too low, leaving progress feeling hollow. This imbalance can stem from poor enemy scaling, uneven resource distribution, or mechanics that punish rather than test skill. It affects everyone differently. Casual players may feel locked out of content, while seasoned players may lose interest when the game no longer demands effort. At its core, difficulty is meant to shape the rhythm of play, and when that rhythm breaks, the entire pace of the game suffers. In the earliest RPGs, players noticed that the game's difficulty would just spike without any warning. In one area you're progressing smoothly, and in the next the lowest mob would be wiping the floor with you, even though you have the latest and greatest gear equipped. This was a painful reality of these games, and the developers did this intentionally. Why? Because of the limited power that the first-gen consoles could provide, they could not make any big games with smoother pacing, so they tried to compact the game so that the console could play it, and they succeeded in doing so. Just one problem. It meant that the game's difficulty curve was too damn steep, meaning that casual gamers had a very hard time getting anywhere in the game. The only way for them to make it through the game was to grind excessively to compensate for the shift, which added playtime for devs but burnt out the normies. There was a select few that took this as a challenge, and those were the same people that would earn bragging rights when they did beat the game. The games that had the most noticeable difficulty curves was Final Fantasy, which punished any unprepared party with that random overpowered encounter ever so often, and Dragon Quest II, which demanded tedious hours of grinding in order to smoothly progress the game. Chrono Trigger was not so bad, but the Mage's Battle definitely showed an obvious difficulty spike in the game's enemies, and that was a rude awakening to most gamers. This is what initially gave RPGs the stereotypical difficulty it has now. Gamers at the time bested the system with persistent repetition, trying anything until something worked. And of those mad lads, some created guides to help others who were struggling. This is what created the two types of RPG gamers, those who buckled under the uneven pressure and those who thrived off of it. By the second generation of consoles, RPGs weren't just about surviving an encounter, but delivering cinematic stories while still testing skill. Developers did this by adding in layered optional content and super bosses that far exceeded the main game's difficulty bracket. A good example of this would be Final Fantasy VII enemies like Ruby and Emerald Weapon, which destroyed anyone who thought that they would be on the same level as the story enemies. The game did encourage progression, but you needed to grind for hours to do so in some situations. This caused frustration to build in the casual gamers, as they would not experience the full game like the mad lads who took the challenge head on. At this point, the imbalance wasn't just about difficulty spikes, rather about the pacing that separated the main story from the optional challenges. This created two different experiences, one for the casual gamers and one for those who wanted more from the game. Only those who are willing to adapt to the new difficulty or exploit game mechanics could survive, and again create guides for the casual gamers who wanted to be a part of the club without putting in those hours. In the end, you were put into two groups. You could embrace the challenge or skip it entirely. The third generation expanded on the worlds themselves, making them larger, more complex, and more cinematic. This caused a new kind of imbalance, grinding. The devs tried to use leveling systems in order to spread out the game better, but instead it just damaged pacing, since now the gamers had to level up in order to deal with the enemies that were a bit too strong just so that they could continue the story. Those who came for the story were hit the hardest by this, since they rarely spend hours on team composition. Final Fantasy X is a good example of this. The sphere grid allowed for diverse character building, but poor management or the lack of it altogether, and you would often find yourself stuck in battles that were harder than they should be, which means progressing the story becomes tedious. Xenosaga had a similar issue, with bosses requiring exceptional level jumps in order to beat them and progress the story. This shows how pacing started to become an issue in games because of uneven difficulty curves, since not every gamer wanted to sit for hours pummeling enemies just to get a drip feed story. While many did express their concerns about this issue, very little was done to address it. The fourth generation showed that at this point in time, unstable difficulty curves had been baked into games themselves. Oblivion did have enemies that scaled to a respective level, but also gave them stronger weapons and armor to compensate for the difference. This naturally meant that the enemies were now too strong for some players to get past, which again affected the game's overall pacing. Some players liked the sense of realism, but others stated that it did not provide a steady difficulty curve. Mass Effect tried to remedy this by introducing different difficulty levels, but ultimately the higher difficulty levels suffered from spikes that made the game hard to play, unless you're prepared to spend more hours grinding to keep up. This meant that most players had to heavily rely on save systems to get by in hard areas, or community guides to help them level up faster, get around enemies, and so on. Players acknowledged that at this point, poor game balancing was the norm, and games showed no signs of fixing it soon. By the fifth generation, devs finally attempted to address the unbalancing with adaptive AI and more difficulty options. While this was a step in the right direction, it ended up dividing the gamers into those who wanted an easy experience and those who wanted chessbot difficulty. Dark Souls 3 was one of the games that did not employ any difficulty settings, but this was done so that anyone could experience the game without a bias. Persona 5, on the other hand, seemed to have fairly balanced play until the boss fights showed up, causing gamers to have to grind in order to stand a chance, repeating the patterns of old games. Cyberpunk 2077 also features a wide range of enemies that had varied strengths. Some of the guys could be kicked around, then the mobs down the street could send you packing, mirroring Final Fantasy all over again. Updates and patches also sometimes greatly adjusted the scaling of enemies in the game, which meant that players had to get a feel of what was made worse or better. This changed how modern games define the difficulty settings. What once was a predetermined difficulty curve is now a limited time event that could change periodically, which is far worse in a sense since now you can't even get used to a set difficulty. The sixth generation reinforced this exact problem. With live service games releasing new expansions and events that had enemies of varying strength, you are constantly forced to adapt or face the harsh reality of a skill issue. The only way to work around this nightmare was to adjust difficulty settings if the game had any, and to heavily adjust your playstyle to accommodate the new changes. At this point, a game's difficulty was not determined by the gamer's skill level, but a patch that the devs would send out when a new expansion comes out. Having a game with a fixed curve started to become a luxury that most single offline experiences would have, and with every year that number shrinks. Eventually, we may only have live service RPGs that are reliant on this flexible difficulty curve, but that is a worst case scenario that I hope does not come to pass. Over time, developers have tried many ways to restore balance and protect the rhythm of play. In the earliest generations, the simplest solution was the introduction of save points and safer grind areas. These gave players a chance to recover after sudden spikes, even if the pacing still slowed. Later, designers experimented with optional content, side quests, hidden bosses, and bonus dungeons so that difficulty could be approached at the player's own pace rather than forced upon them. As RPGs grew larger in the PS2 and PS3 eras, solutions pointed towards systems that managed progression. Sphere grids, skill trees, and scaling mechanics were meant to keep players aligned with the challenge curve. Yet these fixes often created new problems. Scaling sometimes broke immersion, while grind-heavy systems dragged pacing down. Still, they showed developers were asking what tools could keep difficulty fair and why pacing mattered as much as raw challenge. By the PS4 era, solutions became more player-focused. Difficulty sliders, adaptive AI, and accessibility modes gave direct control over challenge. This was a turning point. Instead of one rigid path, players could decide how they wanted to experience the game. Hardcore fans could still pursue punishing modes, while casual players could keep the story flowing. These systems answered who the game is for, not just one audience, but many. In the modern PS5 and PC era, solutions are dynamic. Live service models and procedural systems allow developers to rebalance encounters through patches and updates. This flexibility means imbalance can be corrected quickly, but it also raises new questions. When balance changes, does it disrupt the rhythm players have already adapted to? And where does true fairness lie? In a fixed design, or in evolving systems that shift with time? Looking across the history of RPGs, one truth becomes clear. Imbalance has never been a static flaw, but a shifting pattern that evolves with each generation. In the earliest days, it was sudden spikes that stretched limited hardware. Later, it became grind walls that slowed vast worlds, then scaling systems that bent immersion, And now, adaptive sliders and live service updates that make balance fluid but unstable. Each era reveals not just how games were built, but how players were expected to endure, adapt, or redefine the rhythm of play. The deeper question is not simply whether developers can fix difficulty, but whether balance itself is meant to be permanent. If pacing keeps slipping away, perhaps it reflects the changing expectations of players as much as the limits of design. So the food for thought becomes, if balance keeps slipping away across generations, is it because of design limitations, or because players themselves keep redefining what fair challenge should mean? Thanks guys for watching, and as always, stay safe everyone. Bye for now.